Postcards from a Dying World, the podcast. For more than a decade, I have reviewed over 1,000 books that are mostly science fiction, horror, and bizarro. This feed will feature bonus audio I have produced over the years, as well as a monthly digest of reviews based on what I've read each month, plus the occasional bonus material about my own fiction. Thanks for listening. Hello and welcome to Postcards from a Dying World. My special guest today is Paul Tremblay, who most of you will probably know as the author of Headful of Ghosts, Disappearance. Oh, I'm saying it wrong already. Cabin at the End of the World, and of course Survivor Song, and Disappearance at Devil's Rock. Is that the?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
okay, I got it
Yeah,
right.
you had it.
That's the one I have not read. I have to.
Okay.
So that's why I got it wrong. I'm David Agranoff. I'm the author of Goddamn Killing Machines and Punk Rock Ghost Story, because I know less of you will know who I am. But we're going to assume that you read this book, Survivor Song, and today is going to be a discussion about the writing process of the book. So if you haven't read it, go read it, come back. It's 300 pages. It's a real breezy read. It's an intense read, but it's short, which is one of the things I wanted to talk about because these are typically books that are doorstops, these pandemic books, and these like kind of end of the world things. And at 300 pages, this is really short. At any point, did you consider or think about doing a longer piece with Survivor Song?
No, right from the beginning. Well, one, like I can't write long books. It's not in my DNA. No, but right away, there were two, like once I knew I was going to be doing sort of a zombie riff or a zombie adjacent sort of thing, depending on your viewpoint, I knew one, that I didn't want to do like the sprawling cast of 1,000 characters, super long, zombie book, and not because they're bad, but there have been so many that have been, so well done. It's like, I wanted to do something different. I was drawn to the idea of, with the exception of maybe the interlude, the prelude, interlude, postlude, it takes place over 4 to 6 hours. Like I really was drawn to that compressed timeline. And the second thing, since I said there were two things, was, I didn't want it to be like a loving, almost like fetishistic description of the end of the world. Like at some point in the book, I don't feel like this is a spoiler. I tell the reader that, well, we're talking spoilers anyway.
Yes.
At one point I talk about how, this isn't the end of Massachusetts. It's not the end of the United States. It's not the end of the world. And I felt like that was kind of important because my hope was that would make, one, the stories maybe feel a little bit more realistic, but also maybe more poignant, more tragic, especially, for the characters who don't make it through the book. Right.
And that's the thing, is when it's going on, it does feel like one of those books, and it does feel like the world is ending. And so I think that's something that adds to the postlude is that atmosphere. And look, I'm trying to do this in a discussion of the writing of this book without talking about my own work, but I am a writer too, and I wrote a book, Ring of Fire, that was nominated for the Splatterpunk Award, and I was trying to do kind of a similar thing with that book. So I really appreciated the pace of Survivor Song, because with Ring of Fire, I was trying to do kind of the end of the world in a more condensed way, and I wanted the pace to continue the whole way. So I felt a lot of kinship to Survivor Song when I was reading it, and a little bit of jealousy at just how tight it was. Did you have any specific influences for the pace? Because I know for myself, I was thinking a lot of 28 Weeks Later, not the first one, but the second one.
Right.
The pace of that.
It's funny, like this book, I think more than other ones, I felt like, clearly there are subconscious inspirations that you take from, and there were stuff that I know I wanted to reference too, but I felt like more than the 3 previous novels that I'd written, I felt like I was sort of not on my own in a way, but like I definitely felt like out of my comfort level, like I wasn't riffing on specific movies. other than just the specific zombie sort of genre. I felt like I was more just riffing on like, you know, this history, this, you know, all the comics, all the books, all the movies that, you know, so many people, I'd say more than any other trope at this point that people are familiar with. Mm-hmm. Whereas a lot of my previous novels sort of like were using specific jumping off points. So I think that made it like really difficult especially in the beginning when I was relying on some, you know, the medical research, particularly like, you know, what a hospital's response would be and stuff like that. Again, that was sort of out of my comfort zone. I hate doing research. I'm just not comfortable doing it. Like, you know, I don't have an English degree. I was never really taught like, or I'm sure, I mean, I was taught how to research, but I certainly didn't do it really in college. I mean, I was a math major. So, I mean, just I don't have like the repetition of researching something and be able to put it, you know, into a work, like in an academic sort of way. So anyway, I mean, that's a long way of saying, I mean, there were specific, like I don't know where the pace, so I'm gonna say, I'm not sure where the pace came from necessarily. I mean, I do really like both 20 Days Later. Even that one, I feel like, even though I feel like that one's sort of like, you know, with the exception of maybe the very ending, it feels like it happens over like, in my memory, it feels like it happens over a very short time. Mm-hmm. I don't know, like the farmhouse at the end, like I tried to describe that sort of like the white farmhouse in Night of the Living Dead, you know, just like little things like that. But I didn't really have like a specific zombie movie or apocalyptic movie in mind.
Mm-hmm. And unlike where Cabin at the End of the World was very much riffing on the home invasion thing, and those kind of have a set structure with, you know, how the stories kind of unfold, like somebody has to show up, has to invade the house, that kind of
right
thing. and which, by the way, I loved Cabin at the End of the World, and
thank you.
I really like how you played with the conventions in that one, and I think this one, Survivor Song, whereas I know with like Headful of Ghosts, you're playing with the exorcism conventions to a degree, but I think one of the reasons why you have so many people like dying to know whether she was really possessed or not, and repeatedly asking you, no matter how many times you've told them you're not going to tell them, right? That's something that kind of separates it, right? And the kind of supernatural aspects of Cabin at the End of the World kind of give that a different feel. And I think definitely with Survivor Song, what gives this like kind of an original feel is the ticking clock. And so much of the novel is based on the friendship between Rams and Natalie.
Right.
And I do want to unpack that a little bit more later, but what I think really makes this book different is the ticking clock. And it seems to me, from looking at the acknowledgement, that ticking clock is the germ of the idea, right? Like
yeah. I mean, it started with like, I don't know. I mean, it's weird to say like the novel sort of started a little bit with my own sort of professional desperation, because it was like 13 months to the day a book was due to my publisher, and I hadn't started a book yet. Mm-hmm. For the prior like 5 or 6 months, I had finished up a novella for Growing Things, and I had this idea for another novel, but I just kept putting it off. And by the time July 2018 rolled around, I was like, that supposed idea that I had, I don't have enough time to do that. So I needed something else. And I was I was on my first ever trip to England at the time, and I was sitting on a train, which is partly why I ended up involving England in the story, is to sort of honor where the idea of the book started. And I was just in my notebook, and so I sort of wrote down, like, I was trying to write down other horror tropes, thinking, okay, is there, like I've done with a couple of the previous books, what could I mess with? And I wrote down zombie. And like everybody, I kind of went, but then, I don't know, I just wrote down like, no, pregnant zombie. I feel like I know I've seen movies where a zombie's pregnant and it's like a zombie baby that comes out, or, you know, like the last act of the mother is to give birth to a baby. It's like, oh, how could you have someone who is a zombie, like fully turned zombie, but give birth to a pregnant baby? It was just like, I don't know, a weird question to ask yourself. And then for some reason, it was like, oh, what what I knew about rabies is like, oh, if it was like a rabies virus, like maybe it's possible for someone who has succumbed to rabies to give birth, and that's how it sort of just unfolded from there. Yeah, so no, I feel like in a lot of ways, you keep saying the ticking clock, which I like. And so I think Cabin and Survivor Song really sort of fit together, at least in my head.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like even though there was a ticking clock in Cabin as well, like, they sort of had a timeline. They only had a few chances, supposedly, according to the invaders,
Mm-hmm.
as how many times they could refuse to sacrifice someone in the family. In my head, I thought of Survivor Song as, oh, this is about the horror and the hope of choosing to go on, when everything's awful. And then I felt like Survivor Song was sort of like the next step. Okay, you've decided you're going to try to survive. Like, what does that look like?
So
what are
in
you
a
going
way,
to do?
the ticking clock was going on in your life too, as far as like you were starting later than you usually do on a book.
Yeah, no, for sure.
That
And actually, I thought,
probably added to the pace too, a little bit.
yeah,
Well, and it's
no, no,
cool because you had research help with your sister's a nurse, right? Is that
yes,
where,
yep,
yeah, and you were able to ask those questions. Yeah, and it's weird because it's funny that you say you don't like the research, because one of the things I thought was really good about the book was how well researched it felt. You can't really tell this kind of story without doing the research. You kind of
right.
have to do these things, right? And I know for Ring of Fire, like one of the things I had a whole list. I made a list at the beginning, like these are the different topics I have to research before I can write it.
Uh-huh.
Did you do that? Did you make a list of where you needed to go, or did you do it as you were going?
I typically do it as I'm going, like just so I feel like I'm making headway. I would slow down when I needed to. Although, because I mean the opening, I shouldn't say chapter, but the prologue, like really need a ton of, I guess a little research went into it, but that was more, I could work on that. And then I interviewed my sister, and she got me like her hospital's emergency plan and stuff like that. So I was doing that as we went. I sort of was fortunate that I had happened to read a book called Rabid, A Cultural History of, I forget the rest of the subtitle. I'd happened to read that a few years earlier in audio form while I was walking my dog, which is sort of funny. Listening to rabies while you're walking your dog. So I bought the hard copy of that to reread it. Mm-hmm. And I mean, there's just so much, there's a wealth of rabies information online as well, which made it easier sort of like to dip in and dip out.
And the way that rabies travels through the body, like where it has to move up to the brain is very key to the story. And one of the reasons why it kind of drove it. So you were locked in with the rabies, then I take it from the beginning, like that was going to be the one that did it, right?
Yeah, because I mean, that had stuck with me when I listened to the audio that, oh, here's this weird disease that's not in the blood. It attaches directly to the nerve and passes to the brain. So like, even like when I first had the idea, I was like, oh, if a woman was rabid, I mean, it's not in the blood, it goes to the nerves, it's shed through saliva, like, maybe the kid, in the uterus would be uninfected. Like, and I, in my research, I could not find any cases of someone who was actually succumbed to the virus, or someone who was actually infected being pregnant. There was research about how pregnant women who got the vaccine, it was safe for the fetus to get the vaccine. Mm-hmm. So I kind of felt like the science, I was okay-ish with a lot of science. I will say maybe the funniest bit of research, and one of the last ones I did, I kept putting it off, was I emailed my children's pediatrician to ask, hey, have you ever, I have some questions for this book I'm working on. Have you ever performed a C-section? Like, did you see it did you help like when you were in med school? Some stuff like that. I had to tell him why I was asking him that question, but he was helpful.
Well, and I had a really funny experience when I was researching Ring of Fire, where it's a long story, but I was involved with this activist campaign to keep the Chargers in town called Save Our Bolts. And so I got contacts at the mayor's office because I was going in there for those reasons. And I would stick around and talk to my contact at the mayor's office and say, hey, can you tell me about your disaster plans? Can you do all this? And one of the things that was really funny is he put me in charge of the guy at the water board who's in charge of thinking out disasters for
Oh,
the county. And so I had this, and I found out when I got a hold of him that he was a huge horror reader. And so, but he was like very frightening to talk to, because he would say, every time I'd say,
yeah.
well, you know, how about this terrible thing happening? And he'd say, oh, you think that's bad? Here's this.
Awesome.
And like, that's how I found out that all the water in San Diego County comes through one pipe, which was kind of frightening to me.
Yeah.
Did you have, in your research, what's one of the funny, did you have any of those moments where you're like, I can't use this, but here's this really frightening thing I learned?
No, I didn't stumble upon any of those, terrifying nuggets. Probably better for my mental health. Partly because it was so like, I don't know, I didn't go into any rabbit holes where I didn't, I didn't really need to go, or I wasn't going to go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so I think with my book, what I did for the research is I delayed the book and spent a couple of years researching it while I was writing other things.
Oh, wow.
I didn't have anybody asking me for it,
Yeah.
right, at the time. So I had the time to, like, where I dig into one issue here and there for a little while, and then I'd say like, oh, I got to learn about the firefighters for a little bit, and so that was one kind of nice, fortunate thing of not kind of having a deadline.
Yeah.
But you knew, and this was good, is you knew you had a home for it from the beginning.
Yeah.
And so let's get into the characters, because unless there's anything else on research that, did research change any of the pacing or anything like that on it, or?
No, I mean, I had to take, I had to take rabies and mess with its rate of, or how quickly someone would become infected, obviously. Like real rabies would take weeks, sometimes months, for it to travel from the bite site to the brain, so obviously I made it extra virulent and moved up that time. So, I did mess with the virus a little bit, and the people who succumb to it are more aggressive and more bitey than people who succumb to rabies. Although I will tell you, actually, okay, this is, a bizarre symptom for males, for men who succumb to rabies, is that they sort of become hypersexual, / they'll just like ejaculate like 40, 50 times a day, like uncontrollably.
Whoa.
Yeah. No, and it's described as like being like sort of like a very uncomfortable, very painful sort of thing. So I didn't want to put that into the book, but like in the book that I read from research and Rabbit, they spent quite a bit talking about that.
Oh, yikes. Yeah, that sounds like something well, and thankfully the majority of your characters are women in this book. So like,
right.
So you didn't have to deal with that with Natalie getting infected. And so the book starts with the prelude. You jump right in with the attack and get that going right away. So from the very beginning of the book, Natalie's infected. Was that always the format that you were going to have, like, starting with her with that attack? Because that seemed like the smart choice to me. Like, it really gets it going, and then the whole time the clock is ticking, you start the book with like hitting the stopwatch to go, right?
No, absolutely. Like, well, they call it movies, I guess, a cold open. I wasn't necessarily thinking of movies, but I also didn't want to start with like Zombie Zero, like the first, again, even though that's quite effective in so many movies, in particular, 28 Days Later, I knew like I wanted to just drop people like in the middle of this is happening. And here's 4 to 6 hours, during the middle of, this horrible thing that's happening in Massachusetts.
Yeah. And because you're taking, and I know I talked about this in my review of the book, there's, and I use War of the Worlds as an example. There's the George Pal War of the Worlds that has generals and the global view. And then there's the Spielberg version, which is just Tom Cruise's family. And I guess the Stephen King comparison is The Stand versus Cell, right? And I think, having that narrow focus in some ways, because you don't really know what else is happening to everyone else, gives it a real an air, because really Natalie and Rams don't really know how widespread it is. They kind of discover that as we're reading, right? And I think that really lends well to like how the story unfolds. So let's talk about Natalie and Rams. It's pronounced Ramola, right? Or
yes, Romola. Yeah,
Ramola. Okay. And it's funny because we talked about in our audio discussion about it that I had with Kirk Jones and Daniel Velasti, is that Daniel and I are both Doctor Who fans, and we pictured the woman who's the companion on this season of Doctor Who in her role because of the Indian British connection, and we kind of laughed about it because we were like both kind of saw her in this role. But I think giving her you said that the British thing was like a tip of the hat to being in England,
right.
And I think that's cool because I think the other thing that it does is it gives her like, well, especially now that we're seeing that there is right now, unfortunately, in 2002, and especially with 2010, 2020, sorry, I wish it was 2002 sometimes. In 2020, like the issues of how a person of color is treated versus a white person in very tiny ways kind of makes you question when Rams is going through the situation, when she's having to show her ID and all those things. Like it's in the back of my head, and when the militias show up, I'm thinking a little bit of extra worry for her. What I liked is that wasn't a huge part of it, but it was just subtly there, and I appreciated that in her character. But just tell me, like, why two female friends, because it is such a huge part of this novel.
Well, one, like it ended up becoming, I wanted it to be about friendship as a purposeful break from the three previous novels, which really focused on, parents and families, parents with children, or, in one case was a single parent. Even though it's a pregnant woman, it's not quite a family yet, and her husband dies in the first, 20 pages. Her husband, Paul, no intentional relation to me, or, yeah, so I knew I wanted it to be sort of, I guess, my friendship novel, or I should say a friendship novel. And part of, part of Ramola's being there was one, like, in the Boston area, I don't know, like, what the reputation is around the rest of the country, but at least around here, we're always like, oh, the best hospitals are in Boston, or, we have some really good hospitals in this area. And with Ramola's character, is like, well, most of the doctors that I see that I've gone to are all BIPOC, so I felt like I had to represent that. So it was part of, where Ramola came from. It's just, this is who doctors are in Boston. Many from, from other countries. There are many, as I just said, BIPOC. Some of it was a little bit of a nod to my sister. My sister, one of her good friends at school, her first name was Ramola. And it's sort of a little in-joke with my sister. Ramola is a really outgoing, especially in college, like vivacious personality. And I sort of flipped the personalities a little bit, gave Natalie a lot of, because Natalie's really sort of strong-willed and say anything kind of person, where Ramola is a little bit more, I don't want to say responsible, but she certainly takes a responsibility role in the novel, because she obviously is trying to shepherd her friend through this, terrible landscape to try to get her help. So, I mean, like in a lot of this, I sort of like discovered on the way, like that sort of, if writing is fun at all ever, is, starting with just really loose sort of like guidelines for who these people are and letting them sort of determine themselves, through what they say in the book and through their actions and through their decisions.
Right. And one of the cool things about how they work as a group of friends is that they have to rely on each other's strengths throughout the novel, and it's a powerful and subtle part of the book is how Rand has to like use Natalie's strengths and vice versa, and they really depend on each other. And I think one of the cool things too is that because their friendship goes back to college and they're both adults now, is that whole kind of thing where you get the feeling with Ramallah that she in the beginning feels very put upon, like, you know, like, I gotta help Natalie, and here we go again, and here's this kind of thing. But she, you know, through the process of like trying to help her and save her, she becomes more committed to helping her baby be born and get through this. And that's also with the push and pull of the first person narrative that you get with the recordings that Natalie's making for her child. And so was that always a part of the structure? Was that something you planned, or is that something that just came up while you were writing?
Yeah, no, I definitely, well, one, I knew I didn't want to be first person or third person in Natalie's head for a long time, because I didn't want to be telling the reader what it felt like to be an 8.5-month pregnant woman, since I, you know, am neither, or never will be. So, but I still wanted to get her voice into the book somehow. So, no, right, sort of whatever the quote unquote beginning was, like when I was taking notes, you know, I knew that there was going to be, she's going to leave, you know, sporadic or record sporadic messages for her unborn child. You know, because in those messages, she's not talking about what it feels like to be pregnant. There, you know, I could sort of tap into my own parental anxieties and fears, let that work for me a little bit. You know, and I also thought it was important, you know, and this was actually my friend Nadia Balkan helped me with this. We discussed, while I was in the middle of writing the book, you know, we talked about one of the tropes of science fiction, horror stories, apocalyptic ones, where, oh, you know, we have to save the pregnant woman because she's going to, you know, either metaphorically or literally, you know, help repopulate the world. That's like her sole role. You know, and I tried to make sure that Natalie was rebelling against that idea when, you know, she openly talks about like, oh, I told my husband, no, you have to save me first. Mm-hmm. You know, I thought, I feel like that's a very honest reaction for just about any parent to have. Like, and I feel like it's pretty rare, I feel like, that you see some of the more, I want to say darker thoughts that you have as a parent, but maybe some of the more less sort of polite, like you don't hear people talking about openly those kind of emotions that you have as a parent. Yeah.
One of the more powerful moments is when Rams lies and on the bus. And I've been kicking myself ever since we finished recording the panel discussion about it that I never brought up this chapter because it was one of my favorite scenes of the book is when she lies to get them onto the bus and says that that she's not infected, and they basically get abandoned because they figure it out. And I think it's one of the tensest moments. It's one of the most powerful moments. Now, one of the biggest things that happened for you in this book, is that Stephen King tweeted out about this book and compared you to Richard Matheson, which is, you know, that's pretty freaking cool, Paul.
Oh yeah, no, very amazingly cool, absolutely.
And to me, one of the scenes that really nailed home the Richard Matheson comparison was those last moments before she realizes she's caught, right? Because what Matheson was so good at was these little moments where you know it's coming and you can't get away from it, and just the you know, I think why he made the comparison to Matheson was that the whole book is filled with these moments, but for me, the one that really struck me was this moment of lying on the bus. Was that scene as important to you writing it? Was it a turning point in the book, or was it just another step in the ladder?
No, I spent a lot of time on sort of on that section, trying to get it right, or, what I thought was right. No, and I thought that was, for Romola, she definitely got, I feel like, the hardest questions to confront, that the novel poses, really, the whole time. I mean, poor Romola was put through the ringer. And you're right, and she ultimately, she chooses, it's been funny to see some different people's reaction to it. And she chooses to place those people on the bus in danger. Like, that's immoral. How immoral is it? I don't know. Like, if we're put in that situation, how are you going to react if it's a loved one? Are you going to try to get, we could extrapolate just what we went through in 2020. Like, if you're trying to get someone on a plane, and like, you think they might have a little bit of cough, you're just gonna be like, hey, just don't cough and get on the plane and get home. I don't know. I mean, that's like, maybe, that's definitely immoral. You're putting, yeah. But I mean, it's those kind of questions. I wasn't thinking about that when I wrote it, but like in retrospect, no, I just felt terrible. And thank you for saying that. Yeah, I know. I remember thinking trying to think what Romola would think. Like, she knows through most of that scene that she's going to get caught in the lie, and she's just hoping that it's
that they get
way
there
further.
fast.
It's way further down the line than later rather than sooner. And that's just a horrible, like, powerless, helpless feeling. So I think, hopefully, well, not hopefully, but I think that most of us can, relate to or identify with, in times of crises, that feeling of powerlessness.
Yeah. Well, and I was thinking too that Matheson made it so visual, that I had the thought when I was reading that scene that Matheson would have made sure that we saw each mile ticker like going towards there. But the fact of the matter is, I was thinking about that because it was such a Matheson moment. So, like, my brain went to, like, how would Matheson dial this to 11 at that point? And so, but I think that comparison that Stephen King made with this book has to do with, I saw Matheson at the Stoker Awards one year, and he was talking about how he always viewed suspense as rungs in a ladder. And how he was putting different rungs in the ladder for the story, and that always stuck with me. And what I loved about Survivor Song, in many ways, is that there's a lot of different rungs of the ladder that, as a reader, we're climbing along with the characters, and I think that adds to the pace. But that's why I think King made that comparison. And but yeah,
thank you.
That had to have felt really great. I know he's
absolutely.
I know he's given props to Headful of Ghosts before too, but and Cabin, right?
Yeah, I'm very spoiled.
Yeah, no, that's really cool, and I think like, look, I'm tickled pink for you when I see that. Like, that makes me really excited as somebody
Thank you.
who loves your work. That you got that. So now we talked a little bit about, in our panel discussion, about the chapter where the debate over whether it's zombie or not with the two kids that they meet along the way. And author Kirk Jones, who was on our panel, like, he said that he, no, I think it was Daniel, the other one, Daniel Velasti, crime writer Daniel Velasti. He said that he loved that chapter, and that he said that to him it was very important that chapter happened, because it was important to him that you can't skirt around the zombie thing without at least talking about it. And I'm sure that's how you felt about that chapter, correct?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, one of the initial roles was, like, I before I even wrote the book, I was like, okay, I think I sort of had the general gist of the story. There was going to be the attack. They're going to go to the hospital. Then it becomes a road novel. While they're on the road, it's like, well, I felt like I almost needed, like, a little bit of a comedic relief, and to have a couple of characters serve as proxies for the reader, because everyone's going to be comparing them to zombies. So I wanted to have, like, two self-styled zombie experts. and that afforded me the opportunity to bring back a couple of characters from Disappearance of Devil's Rock. You know, if you haven't read that novel, that's fine. You don't need to have read that novel to enjoy. Well,
no, I didn't know
understand what's happening in Survivor Song. So that was Josh and Luis's first role. But you know, as I got deeper into the book, I thought it was cool to have the two friendships to sort of juxtapose, right? So like we talked about Natalie and Ramola's, you know, there's a very adult relationship, you know, just based on the number of years that they've been friends. You know, in those years, and relationships can be so unique that way. You know, obviously different than familial relationships where, you know, it's a relationship by choice for most, or not by choice, not by choosing for most people, right? You can't choose your sister or your brother or your mother or your father. Friends, you do get to choose, and sometimes it's really intense at the beginning, and then like you never see those people again. But there are some times that you have these friendships for life, and it goes in ebbs and flows, and how much, you know, and how often that you contact each other. Sometimes you're able to pick right back up. I mean, there are sort of complicated things, and that's Natalie and Ramola's relationship. So here's Josh and Luis. You know, they're in their like 17-ish years old. You know, so their friendship is really intense. You know, it's still on the span of a timeline relatively new, and it's almost like you could see how Ramola and Natalie were or would have been at that age, kind of thing. So that was sort of the two roles.
I hadn't thought of that, but that really does serve to show the difference between a mature friendship and one that's still coming of age. And that's and then they become the perfect ones to be like, yo, dude, zombies.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, I was lucky because the zombie novel that I wrote was a satire, so I could just totally play with that. But I try my hand at a serious zombie novel. I've decided to leave it in the trunk. And what I did with that one was just I had people refer to the Z word or don't mention the Z word, and I think you took the better approach as far as like, because I think I was trying to stray away from it, and I think that by just heading it off in one chapter with one scene that's a good almost comic relief, which this book definitely needed a valve of relief at some point, was very important, and I think some writers might not realize that they have to do that, but in a book that's this tense, having a moment where the readers can take a breath and kind of laugh is really important, and so that's something that I appreciated that you're doing there too.
Well, thanks. So, yeah, I mean, again, I thought it would be, you know, realistic that, you know, if something like this were to happen, like so many of us who have no experience with it would have no choice but to sort of at least look at it somewhat through the lens of what we know from pop culture, right? So I knew there was no avoiding it. Like, no, people would joke about zombies. I mean, I did it in the Facebook, you know, page right off, you know, in the intro. But I also thought it was equally important to, you know, given what the virus was in my story, to have Ramola like say, no, these are not zombies. These are people who are infected. You know, they're not monsters. You know, so I thought, you know, that again, her role in that part was important.
Yeah, and in some of these doorstop pandemic books, there would have been some subplot with a character that we would have spent 150 pages with learning about how like they're just an infected person, and what's great is that when you're doing a fast-paced novel like this, you get to kind of do it, and I almost think that's in a way the best science fiction, for example, does world building in subtle moments that you almost don't notice. And so what I appreciated about that was almost a sci-fi level of world building where it's not harped on, it's not something that we talk about for a long time, but it's something that's done really quickly, and it serves two purposes. And that's one of the things that I appreciate as a writer, is that you're serving two narrative purposes. You're doing the world building, and you're also doing that relief valve thing. So I appreciated that. Now, another thing that's kind of very subtle in the book, and I appreciate it also for its subtlety, was the attack coyotes that are kind of just there, and you don't overuse them, that they're almost just like this could happen, right? And this is a scary thing but they're not like, you know, again, they're not 100 pages of like, we've got to avoid the attack coyotes to get to the hospital, right?
Right.
And so what was the thought? I think I know, but what was the thought in not making this a bigger subplot? You know, like, because, you know, some writers would probably have Rams and Natalie having to avoid the coyotes for 75 pages, or like having to outsmart them and trap them in a door or something, you know.
You know, at some point, it's funny, like when I first wrote like because I still had to pitch my publisher on it a little bit. So I wrote like a 2 to 3 page summary, like a really loose sort of half-ass summary that really only summarized like the first 100 pages, you know, in the hospital. And then I sort of like hand waved, oh, you know, this is going to happen. Something like this is going to happen in the rest of the book. I envisioned, instead of a bus, like I wanted to try to get Natalie and Romola onto a train and have like the train taking them out to the western part of the state or something. But it wouldn't work. I kept going back to, that really wouldn't happen in real life. Like, it didn't seem realistic, like a horde of, you know, I was like, why would the train stop? Like, is a horde of coyotes going to stop a train? I'm like, no, that really wouldn't happen. So like, I sort of like picked, like, I knew they had to try to go to another hospital. So, I just pecked at that until it became somewhat realistic to me. You know, and I didn't want it to become like adventure-y feeling where it's like, they're battling like, you know, 10 coyotes. I mean, and that's actually sort of the part of the role of the interlude for me. It ended up not being this way, but like I was initially going to write it as like, this might be all in one of their heads. Like, he's over imagining like the scope of the battles. And I still think you can read it that way, that, you know, this is from their point of view. They see themselves, or at least it's from Luis's point of view, because Josh has already succumbed to the virus pretty much. Like, you know, this is
something be ambiguous at some point.
Yeah, this is them in their big heroic final battle, right?
Right.
Yeah, so I did get to do that in the interlude, where it's like, okay, it's almost like the comic book superhero zombie battle with all these different animals, but try to write it in like in a storybook kind of manner. So, yeah, so that part I felt like I was sort of, you know, as far as like what did Romola and Natalie have to go through, that I was sort of figuring out as I went, you know, just like chip by chip almost.
Yeah.
Whatever I mean by chip, I guess I mean like knocking pieces. No one can see me holding my hand up and chiseling out things right now, but that's what I was doing.
Right. Well, some will have the video, because I will put this up on YouTube too.
Okay.
But yeah, and so, you know, okay, so getting more towards the end here, once they get to the farmhouse, and, you know, was it always a decision to have Rams on her own to do the C-section? I assume, yeah, because that would be the most terrifying aspect. Because even if she has the training, and it's important that she is a doctor and she's seen how to do this, it's a whole nother thing when you have to do it yourself and you're in that moment. And that made that made me a little sweaty just reading it, not having to actually be there and do it. So, but the moments of Natalie just finally succumbing to the disease and her having to duct tape her up, and the screams, it made me think of, and I made the comparison, is just because it's a movie I recently watched, but the Joseph Gordon-Levitt movie where he plays the pilot in the plane that gets hijacked, and the whole movie takes place in the cockpit, and it's a great claustrophobic thriller. And part of the thing of the movie is the entire like first half an hour, someone's banging on the door nonstop. And I thought of that when I was because I saw that movie as I was about 2/3 the way through reading this book. And so when Natalie's screaming at the end and getting towards the moment where she has to do the C-section, I thought to myself how horrible it would be for Rams to not only have to do this operation, but it's her best friend screaming her guts out the whole time. And I was
Right.
like, God, that would be horrendous to watch in a movie, to hear it. I mean, like, but at the same time, it really added to the sensory overload for me as the reader. That idea of her screaming while she was having to take her phone and use the power on her phone. And by the way, that was a great moment, a really subtle world building moment where she realizes that Natalie's phone has 30% on it, and how short amount of time had passed that her phone would still have that much charge. A plus, Paul.
Oh, thanks.
A plus. That was a moment where I was sitting reading the book, and if I had a hat on, I would have tipped it to you. Just as a writer, reading these moments, like, yeah, like I just, those little moments for me, those are Matheson moments.
Thanks.
That's where Uncle Steve, the master, is picking up on it. But anyways, so the C-section, you must have really thought about that sensory overload and the screaming. Like that had to be really on your head when you were thinking about it, right? I mean, like that's the tension of the whole.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, that was like the thing I was like, oh, I'll worry about that when I get there, sort of like how much I wanted to show. Like, I didn't want to go into too much graphic detail as it was happening. You know, I do have Romola sort of mentally walk through what the steps of a C-section would be, but not as she's actually performing it. You know, so that was, you know, I just putting it there would just make it, you know, I think just leaving it there was enough for the reader to not have to, like, I don't know, I didn't feel like it would have been right to see necessarily like the full gore effect kind of thing.
Well, and that's where the panel came into play, because Daniel read it on Kindle, I read the hardcover, and Kurt listened on the audiobook. And so they had no idea until I picked it up and showed them over Zoom, like how you had written it. So how much did your editor?
Oh, so the Kindle, sorry to interrupt, so the Kindle didn't have spaces in between?
It did, but not to the level to which the published one did. And there was no indication that that was happening in the audiobook, according to Kirk.
Okay.
And I don't know how they would dramatize that, if they would do long pauses. But what was funny is because when I'm showing them these pages, and for those who are watching on YouTube and not just listening, the large spaces between, for example, Ramallah paces at the foot of the bed, and then the quote, never leave me, I'll never leave you neither, you know, all that stuff. There's long, and what you're doing, at least in my opinion, as the reader, and I'm gonna take a second to talk about the reader's experience here, because we get to spoil this, is that I'm having to put that all in my head. And look, it's funny because personally, when I get to the end of the book and I think I know what's happening, sometimes I start doing pages a little faster. Just admit that that's the thing that I do when I think I know what's happening. And what this did is it made me slow down, because I'm thinking about, you know, okay, so on this page, for example, on page 285, it says, as Ramallah finishes the initial incision, Natalie's earlier groans and screams ring so clear in her head as to be happening now. There's a large space. The light in the room is terrible is the next line, right? And so I don't know if I'm thinking of it as Ramallah is out of her body and she's not seeing it, or I'm supposed to think about it, but I'm spending a lot of time here thinking about what's happening in this space, but it's all in my mind.
Yeah.
You're leaving it up to me. And I just thought this was genius. I thought this was an excellent thing to do. So now on your end, as the writer, what are you thinking? What is your editor saying to you, and what is your publisher saying? I'm interested now. I'll shut up for a while.
Yeah.
I just wanted to get.
No, thank you. Yeah. No, I mean, I mean, just about all what you said I was going for, so I'm glad it worked. What I ended up doing is at one point in that last chapter before the postlude, you know, I started when I wrote it in Microsoft Word, I was like, all right, I'm going to start increasing the spaces in between the paragraphs by 1 extra line. So it started at the regular, whatever spacing it was 2, and then things started slowly to expand in between the paragraphs, and sometimes single sentences until obviously there's like, for the last one, there's a few pages worth. I've always been fascinated by the use of like blank space or white page space in books, if it's there for a reason. I think Mark Danielewski in House of Leaves is a case where he used it. Before this book was even a thing in my head, like I had thinking about the white space thing, I was like, oh, you know what I would love to do? It would be kind of cool to do a book, and I never had an idea for it, where the book was 3 different characters, like 3 different narrators, right? Character 1, 2, 3, and the book is told through there. And then at some point, I'd have one of the characters die, but I would still keep that person section would appear once, but it would just be like a blank page or 2. Because I felt like, oh, that would be like a cool way to like, I don't know, remind the reader that this character's gone and it's irrevocable. Like you see this empty space. So I guess I sort of used it a little bit. Like the first really big blank space appears with Natalie's last recorded message to her child, and that's representing that she's gone. Like she has succumbed to the virus at this point. And so then in that last chapter, I also wanted to sort of mirror, like Romola is sort of talking about how I'd like to try to get through what she's going to have to get through. She's using, like, she mentions her board. She imagines like the steps that she imagines her mind is like a whiteboard, and she writes down the steps. I talk about how it gets messy. So sort of also trying to tie in, which I don't know if it was that successful, the comparison between the whiteboard of her mind and like the expanding parts in between. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, sometimes, sorry, go ahead. What were you saying?
Now, what happened when your editor read it?
Yeah, she never complained once about it. She was like, you just have to be clear with the design, what you want. But she was fine with it. Yeah. And part of it was me being a little bit of a wise ass for readers of previous books who didn't like the ambiguous endings. Like, it's like, oh, because I'm going to have the last line be, she cries, and then have a bunch of blank pages. And then people are like, oh, that son of a bitch, he's not telling us if the kid lives or not, like the fake and ambiguous ending. But obviously, the postlude comes after.
Right. Which, to me, the she cries was not ambiguous. It's like, it's clear that she was born. So, I really, well, I guess you could.
It could be Romola crying. It could be the kid crying. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, I see what you're saying. Yeah, and yeah, you were kind of being a smart ass there, sure. And I appreciate that. But the postlude in a lot of ways is kind of, well, I mean, you're showing that Rand's clearly adopts the kid, and you are giving an unambiguous ending, which, well, look, it's funny because, poor, there's only so much I'm going to defend M. Night Shyamalan, but like, he got locked into the twist endings to the point that when he didn't do it, people were like trying to figure out the twists, and then it's just like, no, he just wrote a movie with a bad ending, and it's like, and look, and I'm a defender of something that I think Unbreakable is a work of genius. So, I'm not.
Yeah, it's a great movie. Yeah,
I'm not talking total smack, but in a lot of ways too, I'm sure people were assuming you were going to do ambiguous. So you did have to think on that, and it's a good way to just say like, nope, you don't have to. A couple books in, I'm telling you, you don't have to wait for the ambiguous ending. They sometimes will have that. They sometimes will not.
Yeah, I mean, I would hope that I would never like try to force one on. Like, I felt like the other 3 books, I'd say Devil's Rock is probably less ambiguous than the other 2, at least in terms of the ending. To me, those endings are the endings of the book. There's they fit thematically. They're there for a reason. The cabin at the end of the world is about the choice that, the 2 men make. It doesn't really matter to me if the world ends or not. The story is about the choice. In A Head Full of Ghosts, to me, the horror is the ambiguity. We'll never know. Like, and to me, how that parallels our real life. So, this story did not call for ambiguity, so I wasn't going to try to force it in.
Mm-hmm.
So like I would say with the postlude though, when I wrote the book, and finished the first draft in August of 2019, I thought it was I thought the postlude was sort of like a sneaky, not over the top, but kind of horrific. Like, because for Romola, yeah, she survives, but her life isn't really what she wants it to be. I mean, she talks about how she didn't want to move back to England. She imagined like traveling by herself. It was like a goal of her life. And, here she is, forever changed. Like, she's not a doctor anymore. I sort of leave that up to the reader if it's her choice, or if, or she couldn't go back because of sort of the breach of quarantine protocols. So like when I first wrote, like, this is definitely not a happy ending for Romola.
No.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the kid, Lily, lives, but I would say since the book has come out and most people have read it in 2020, the postlude is much more of a happy ending, or it reads happier now to me than it did pre-COVID life.
Well, look, and I come from the perspective of an intentionally childless person who made that decision. So it's funny because when I realized what the book was about, it's really funny, and this plays into my reaction to the postlude, is that I was like, I'm not so sure if the whole, like, I've got to help this baby being born is going to affect me as much as it would some other people.
Yeah.
And it's funny because I've had to write parents before, and as a childless person, I've made sure to try and talk to as many parents about what that feels like. So to make sure that, because as writers, we have to empathize with people that we don't.
Right.
It's funny because I've talked many times before about how being a writer or like actually taking writing seriously has made me a more empathetic person, because I'm always thinking about I'm trying to think about how people feel about things, even if I don't agree with it or if it's not me. Right. And so it was interesting because I think as a person who is not like, I'm a teacher and I like kids to a certain degree, right?
Yeah.
But the ending was not the happy ending for me, because I did see the whole, like, well, my first reaction was, wow, she's got to be a parent now, and she didn't
want to be.
Yeah. Right? So I did see that, and I did not necessarily see it as the happy ending of, like, it's happy in the sense that she was able to save the child's life, but now she feels this commitment to Natalie long after she's gone, and she has to, and so I did see that. And so I do think it's interesting, because I think what you set up with the postlude is that not everyone's going to see it the same way. So there is still some ambiguity in it, in the sense that not everyone's going to see it the same way, because, definitely I think the difference between a person who's, all about kids and the people who are not are gonna read it differently.
Right.
And so yeah, I had a different reaction to it, but that's not to say, and look, and I've had this too, because with some people, like when you're an intentionally childless person, sometimes people take it personally, and they're like, and I'm not judging
because you're clearly smarter than they are.
Well, no, I mean, I'm not judging other people, but my personal reaction to that ending is very different, and I think that is going to make it different. And it was funny because the two other people that were on the panel with me, Kirk and Daniel, are both parents. So when we discussed it, it was different between the three of us on how. And it was funny because Daniel had the comment. He's like, "Well, I only like my kid," he had a, kind of funny reaction to it. And I, but I do think that the difference in how someone reads the end of this book is going to come in their perception, and I think that's true of any good book. And but and then one last thing that I want to kind of get to is the the layout of the book is really cool, and it has a really cool design where the prelude, the interlude, and the postlude look different and have kind of they have a different page color and
Right.
like cool old English design, like in the titles, and it gives the book a really produced feel to it. That had to be really cool for you to see, like how they laid out the book. Was that something that you requested, or is that something that they brought to you?
Well, I requested like a little to make those three sections look a little different, but they took the ball and ran with it, and I was very happy with what they did. You know, with the prelude, I have to stop and think every time. The prelude, the interlude, the postlude. You know, I wanted a different font. I told them, it was like, yeah, like a quote unquote storybook font. You know, just to continue to mess with the line that this isn't a fairy tale, it's a song. And then reference fairy tales all throughout the book. Just kind of being a smart ass in some ways. You know, so I wanted those three to look, you know, and they were maybe written a little bit in a storybook, a more storybook kind of way, a more like narrative, a more authorial, intrusive narrator. That's almost like third person omniscient, not quite, in those three sections. So again, I just said I wanted like these block paragraphs. I wanted a different font. But, you know, then the design team came back with, you know, with how the pages looked, and I loved it.
Yeah, it looks, I mean, it's an amazing looking book.
Yeah, thank you. No, I'm very lucky.
Yeah, it's really cool. And so, and that whole, like, it's a song, not a fairy tale, that's where the title comes from. There isn't a specific reference to anything else that's hidden, because I know like Headful of Ghosts comes from a Bad Religion song. And
yeah, well,
by the way, worked on hooking me, because the first time I ever noticed your work was at Mysterious Galaxies. I was walking and I saw the title and said, hey, that's from a Bad Religion song, and then picked it up, and then my friend who was with me was like, oh yeah, there's a ton of buzz about that book. And
oh, that's so cool.
it was Bad Religion that hooked me the first time.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, I'm a big music geek. I love music, you know, particularly punk and, you know, some metal. I mean, I'm kind of like bounced all over the place, but those tend to be my favorites. So like, you know, the prelude, interlude, postlude, those are like parts of names of songs. And when I first wrote the book, I was going to try to go overboard with it and name like all the chapters, like, oh, this is the first verse. And that didn't really work, but I kept the interlude, postlude stuff. But just in terms of the feel, like the shortened timeline, like, you know, particularly, you know, punk songs are usually 3 minutes and under, you know, so I wanted to try to make the book feel like this fast, intense sort of experience, you know, and have it feel, you know, exciting, but also sort of melancholic, which is a lot of my favorite songs sort of are. But at the same time, still like referenced fairy tales all throughout the book, like when people succumb to the rabies virus, when they turn, you know, they say gibberish, but what they say are actually sort of garbled lines from a host of different Grimm's fairy tales. You know, and the titles to the postlude, interlude, and prelude are from Grimm's fairy tales as well. So that's sort of like sprinkled in.
Yeah, and it's really cool, neat details. And you're a big Husker Du fan, right?
Yeah.
Oh, that new Bob Mould song is great.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Looking forward to the full album.
Just wanted to put that out there. He really, he's doing 2020 right with that song. Yeah, I think when you were in San Diego, we talked briefly about Husker Du. It might have been. I don't remember why, but I think that's where my memory comes to. But anyways, yeah, so I think we covered the book pretty well.
Yeah,
you know what's cool is I usually write a lot of notes, and I thought I was going to be fine without notes because the book was really fresh in my head. And I did the panel without notes, and I was really mad that I missed the scene with the bus, and so I'm glad we got to that. because to me that
All right.
definitely one of the best moments in the book, and kind of a hinge moment. And I know your hard work on Paul Bear's Club, which that's the title, right? Correct?
Yes. Yes. Yep.
And yeah, that sounds really great. Sounds like it's kind of maybe you're playing with the coming of age tropes, maybe.
Yeah, a little bit. It's been a challenge early because the last two books have really been in such a compressed timeline, and this is, this book is really going to span some decades. I feel like I've gotten bogged down by like, oh, I'm telling this like in real time. I need to, some things need to be told in real time. I need to spread it out. So,
yeah. Well, I don't know. It sounds to me, I only know what you told Jeremy on the Powell's interview, and it sounded to me, it had a real early Robert McCammon sound to it.
We'll see. I mean, it definitely starts with a high schooler in 1988/89. And actually, there's quite a few explicit references to Husker Du. In fact, each chapter title is a Husker Du song title, and there's a reason for it. So,
well, hopefully, pretty soon, to follow up the Stephen King tweet, we'll get a Bob Mould tweet that he read Survivor Song.
Oh man, that's my holy grail. But it's okay if it doesn't happen. I will say briefly, as an inebriated like 21 or 22-year-old, myself and a few friends, saw Bob after one of his shows, and Bob sort of famously doesn't really do autographs. It's just like a scribble. But I don't know. I think he just wanted to get rid of us because we asked him to come out for pizza and he didn't want to. But basically, he all I had on me for a piece of paper in my wallet, because this was 1992 or 3 or whatever it was. This is what you carried around with you back then, was my Social Security card. So the front of my Social Security card has Bob Mould's scribble on it.
I have a friend whose outgoing phone message is Billy Bragg. He recorded Billy Bragg saying, Tom's out saving the world. And so Tom's like, I'm never changing.
That's awesome.
He very smartly got him to record it. But I had the experience of, for me, as being the straight edge kid, I got to meet Ian MacKaye.
Oh, wow.
And I had written a report in school about Discord records and independent record labels. And I'm very embarrassed now as an adult that I gave him a copy of it. And I can't imagine how ridiculous it looked to him. But, he had those moments, and
yeah,
it's just one of those things. Well, Paul, it was really great talking to you about Survivor Song. I really love this book.
Thank you, David.
Yeah, I mean, it's what I'm hoping people will get out of this is a little kind of commentary track, almost like feel to your experience in writing this, and I think there's a lot that writers can learn from the lessons that you figured out and giving us this great book, because each new book is a journey, and you got to write it and we got to read it. I love the experience. So
well, thank you. It's very kind. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Thank you. It was very kind, and it was a lot of fun to get to talk about spoilers and just talk about the book. So I really appreciate it.
Yeah, and this will be a two-parter, so hopefully people will get their fill of Survivor Song and get excited for the next one. And I just really appreciate your time. So thanks for joining us on Postcards from a Dying World.
Thank you.